When people think of armoured vehicles, they usually think of tanks, big guns, massive chassis, and wide tracks. But some of the most vital vehicles ever employed in military history weren't built to fight, they were built to see. Today, we're looking at the evolution of Daimler's armoured cars, from some of the earliest vehicles to the Dingo, Daimler's heavy armoured car, and finally the Cold War Ferret. This is the story of how Britain tackled the ever more demanding world of military reconnaissance from horses to the CVR. So let's begin. The armoured car was born out of necessity just before the First World War. The increased lethality that came with modern weapons rendered the cavalry charges we had grown accustomed to throughout the centuries obsolete. War planners the world over sought for a solution, and throughout it all, one name keeps occurring: Daimler. Early armoured cars were basically civilian vehicles with armour plates bolted on. For example, Italy. Having never produced a really significant armoured car design, they deserve a place in military history as being the first country to have used a machine gun car in true war operations, thanks to an opportunity offered by the Italo-Turkish conflict. This occurred in late 1912 when such vehicles were sent to North Africa. They were very effective at providing close-range machine gun support to their troops, with them being described to have such an impact that even single vehicles could significantly alter battle outcomes. However, only being designed to police the dominions of the Empire, with very similar examples like the Lanchester armoured car. They worked well on roads, but as we saw with World War I, warfare doesn't take place on roads, and if the vehicle you're arresting the weight of your life upon struggles everywhere unpaved, well, you can imagine where that leads. But luckily, some very clever people working with and for the Daimler Motor Company already had rather extensive experience in heavy-duty vehicles, and began work experimenting with things like stronger drivetrains and the genius idea of four-wheel drive. The lessons from the interwar years couldn't have been clearer. Speed without mobility is useless. By the late 1930s, the British Army knew it required something different, and so called out to any company who could fulfill its needs. The result was the Daimler Dingo, officially called Car Scout Daimler Mark I. In fact, the name Dingo was actually stolen from Elvis's entry for the design when the BSA won the competition. But anyway, this vehicle wasn't built for fighting. It was a scout by intention. Small, fast, and hard to hit. With four-wheel drive and independent suspension for each wheel, with these big coil springs, the Dingo could go where earlier armoured cars simply couldn't, and accomplish it considerably quicker than any of its contemporaries. Powered by a 2.5 litre 55 horsepower Daimler OHV straight-six petrol engine located at the rear of the vehicle, meant it was managing speeds of 60 miles an hour, which at the time was out of this world. The Daimler Dingo would go through three marks of evolution, with the Mark I having some rather interesting quirks, the most notable being its four-wheel steering arrangement, which even now would make modern cars cry in shame at its turning circle. But as you can imagine, inexperienced drivers found the vehicle difficult to control, and thus they did away with it in the later models, unfortunately increasing its turning circle by about 65%. The roof of the first Dingos was a solid metal plate that lifted on a pantograph system to slide backwards, forcing the crew to use either the single door on the side or start the tedious process of sliding the roof back. And I must say, in all honesty, if you're not the one using it to fight, then the idea is brilliant. Solid protection against shrapnel or small arms fire, but as what happens with an awful regularity with military vehicles, the poor souls inside were not high on the list of consideration and found massive difficulty trying to execute a swift escape. So, the Mark 1A followed, with the only change being a folding roof. Further change came with the Mark 1B, having new features like a different armoured radiator grille and revised engine cooling. But the major changes came with the later Mark II models. The four-wheel steering was dropped in favour of the front axle steering, and the chassis strengthened, along with a few cosmetic changes and revision of the lighting equipment. The Mark III came and dispensed with the roof entirely, having only a canvas cover, to save weight and allow more crew freedom, while introducing a new waterproof ignition system. Interestingly, the weight saved from losing the solid roof was actually used to thicken the belly plates to give it better protection against mines, and would later be transposed onto the Mark IIs like ours seen here. The transmission included a Wilson pre-selector gearbox made by Self-Changing Gears Limited, which was a subsidiary of the BSA, a fluid flywheel and propeller shafts that were protected inside the channels of the chassis section, giving the Dingo its very low profile at around 5'1". This was joined up with one of the Dingo's most ingenious features, which was its transfer box, allowing the vehicle to retreat at full speed without turning around. The seat is cocked to about 30 degrees to assist the driver when reversing, while the commander/gunner sat on the left-hand side of the vehicle in a swivel seat. This enabled him to turn to operate either the number 19 radio set or the Bren-like machine gun poking out the front. Just an aside, these lads going backwards have two moons between their legs because from personal experience, it feels at least 3 times as fast backwards as forwards, and the sharpness of the steering becoming rear-wheel steer is unbelievable. But as I mentioned, it was a scout, and only carrying a Bren gun and some small arms weapons behind the two-man crew meant it wasn't in any way, shape or form prepared for vehicle-on-vehicle combat, even when that Bren was swapped out for the .55 Boys AT rifle. However, despite what most people think, the Dingo's front armour certainly held its own at 30mm, meaning it could take at least one hit from all infantry-based rifles, and with half an inch on the sides, it provided better crew protection than initially thought. This scout car was so good, it served into the 60s. The fact was, the crews loved it, and the enemies hated trying to hit it. But warfare has a habit of changing requirements, especially in a conflict so world-encompassing as the Second World War. And whilst light scouts like the Dingo were excellent, when they were spotted, even with all their attributes, they were still relatively a fish in a barrel. So Daimler proposed and then went on to answer a new question. What if reconnaissance vehicles could fight their own way out? The Daimler Armoured car evolved from what was essentially an enlarged Dingo. Well, actually, it was a parallel development to the Daimler Dingo, but was considerably larger with a bigger 95 horsepower engine and supported a turret with the quick-firing 2-pounder gun as its main armament. With a coaxial 7.92 Beezer machine gun, this was the same weaponry mounted on almost all early British tanks, meaning it soon became one of the most heavily armoured cars of the war, giving a nasty bite to the cheetah of the military world. It kept its tremendously successful four-wheel drive system and coupled it with excellent reliability. This led to its brilliant performance in both North Africa and Europe. Unlike the Dingo, it had a crew of 3 rather than 2, with the driver sat in the front and the commander and gunner who took their places inside the cramped turret, just large enough to allow the recoil of the light 2-pounder gun. Uniquely, the commander could drive the car backwards, but actually forwards, sitting in a separate rear-facing seat using his own steering wheel and controls. There were only 2 marks to the heavy armoured car, 1 and 2, with 2 having a redesigned gun mount and mantlet, slightly modified cooling system for better performance, and a new escape hatch was added to the roof to allow the driver to exit the vehicle more easily in emergencies. However, by late war, the calibre of its gun was becoming obsolete, and any efforts to improve its armament became detrimental to its intended capabilities, proving that firepower alone was never the full solution. After World War II, everything changed. The Cold War demanded all the same attributes, speed, firepower, agility and reliability, to gain the edge in the information battle. But one area that expanded dramatically was the need for flexibility. Not just armoured duels or just scouting, it needed a base that could tackle both. Enter the Daimler Ferret, Lighter than the heavy armoured car, but more nimble due to its reduced size, it still managed to maintain a very respectable cross-country speed. The bigger wheels of the Daimler Heavy did give it better overall cross-country performance, but with the ferret being simpler in design, it reflected the same philosophy but with an extended emphasis on combined arms. It needed to see first, move fast, and avoid contact. It was built to survive long enough to report what it saw. It used the 6-cylinder 4.26 litre water-cooled Rolls-Royce B60 petrol engine that replaced the Daimler's 2.5 litre in the Dingo and produced approximately 116 horsepower at 3,300 RPM. It used the same big spring suspension from before as well as the drivetrain, but in all honesty the ferret came with almost too many variants, from open-top Scouts to turreted versions. Some even fitted with ATGMs. I'm going to quickly show you the list on Wikipedia and I'll try and explain any interesting changes like the ATGMs. So first, the Mark 1. It's a liaison vehicle with no turret and armed with a 30 cal Browning machine gun. The Mark 1-2 is the same as the Mark 1, but fitted with a fixed turret with a hinged roof door. It had a crew of 3 and swapped to British armament using the Bren LMG and later the GPMG. The Mark 1-3 as 1-1, but fitted with a flotation screen like DD tanks. The Mark 2 original reconnaissance vehicle with the 2-door turret from the Elvis Saracen. And the 2-6 is as the 2-3 converted as a carrier for the Vigilant anti-tank missile. The Mark III was where the real change happened and would become the basic hull for the Marks 4 and 5, with larger wheels, heavier armour, stronger suspension, and a flotation screen. Mark V is personally the most interesting, with it being the same as the Mark III hull, but fitted with an unusually wide and flat turret for swing-fire anti-tank guided missiles, and an L7 GPMG. A total of 4,409 ferrets were manufactured between 1952 and 1971 when production ceased. But as some of you know, this wasn't the only wheeled vehicle to come to life after World War II. Whilst the ferret was extremely capable at its designed role of reconnaissance and light infantry fighting, it was ultimately outmatched when coming against any sort of substantial firepower, just like the Dingo it had replaced. So, in an effort to use the idea of the heavy armoured car we have spoken extensively about, a company called Elvis created a monster, and in 1958, the Elvis Saladin roared out of the factories. Saladin is a 6-wheeled armoured car that weighed in at 11 tons, offered a top speed of 45 miles an hour, and had a crew of 3. They were armed with a 76mm low-pressure rifled gun, later used by the Scorpion CVRT, and had notable service being employed by the British Army in the aid of emergency. Big enough to take more than a decent punch, but still wheeled so you avoid the hassle of tracked armour. One thing is for sure, you're definitely not ramming a Saladin with something like a truck. Not twice anyway. But with only a total of 1,100 units built by 1972, you can see that the Daimler Ferret took over a vast majority of the roles, and Saladins were more of a backup for specific situations rather than being the mainstay vehicle for every task. Now, I'll show you a picture of all 4 of them, and if you look at them side by side, you can clearly see the evolution from one to another and the families they both belong to. From the Dingo to the Ferret and beyond, Daimler's armoured cars tell a story of adaptation. Each design wasn't only a replacement, it was a response to the changing climate of military intelligence. They influenced later reconnaissance vehicles like the CVR, Combat Vehicle Reconnaissance, both wheeled family and tracked, CVRT, and proved that wheeled armoured vehicles had a permanent place on the battlefield. Even today, many survive in museums and private collections, including our own, the Pearson Military Vehicle Collection, as reminders that information has always been one of the most powerful weapons of war. If you enjoyed this breakdown of military vehicle evolution, then please consider subscribing. This video was made in response to a comment asking for a topic, and I would love to do more of what you want. So let me know any other topics in the comments. And one final question, which armoured car do you think got it right?